What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about the Separatist holdouts in CANON. Just because the leadership was destroyed didn't mean that everyone stopped fighting for the Separatist cause, or just wouldn't admit defeat to the new empire. Even though a droid shutoff code disabled most of the droid starfighters and infantry, the organics with them often found ways to hide them from the empire, recode them, and then redeploy them. We'll try and do this in chronological order so that you can see how Separatist forces reacted during those first days following Vader's massacre on Mustafar. This will take us all the way up to some holdouts operating as late as 31 ABY, 50 years after the Clone Wars, and just 3 years before the destruction of the Hosnian system. So when the CIS leaders could not be contacted, and a majority of the droids went limp, many Separatist generals fled to the western reaches. Space is big, so even though this sector contained Mustafar itself, most of it was in the Outer Rim, and all bordered by the even more remote area of the Unknown regions. To address this, the Empire launched the Western Reaches pacification operations, a nicer way of saying Imperial mop-up forces that brutally leveled any resistance. This would last from 19 BBY to 15 BBY, and before gaining the title of Grand, it would be Moff Tarkin that was assigned to head these campaigns. A good way to tell how Palpatine wanted these holdouts taken care of is to realize that Tarkin was chosen after his presiding over the Antar atrocity. Antar 4 was a world that had been a member of the Republic since its inception, but by a narrow margin the population decided to align with the CIS. Despite nearly half of its population still being Imperial loyalists, Tarkin was encouraged to make an example out of this world, terrorizing its population with a combination of orbital bombardments, mass arrests, and mass executions that to everyone just seemed to be indiscriminate. This was shortly after taking over power, so Palpatine's detractors still had some freedom in the media, and it was news reports from Antar 4 that pulled Tarkin into the spotlight. But by hunting down Separatist remnants in the western reaches, he would be far from public scrutiny, while putting those proven cruel tactics to greater use. They might be evil, but you can't deny their genius, as Orson Krennic and Tarkin worked together to direct the flow of CIS holdout fighters towards locations called Legacy Planets. Worlds like Samovar and Wandi Rafa were considered environmentally protected worlds, but unlucky for them, also housed enormous stores of Dunium and Dolovite, materials crucial to the building of the Death Star superweapon. The pacification operations justified its invasion of these legacy worlds on the premise that Separatists certainly would not be above stripping them, and because this was an active military zone, any reporters snooping around there could be detained and suspected of being spies for the CIS Remnant. These worked as a perfect combo, having all the minerals and secrecy you needed to test some of the early Death Star functions, and even better was the fact that losses in this region could be blamed on the Separatist boogeyman. When a testing facility was consumed by a meltdown of a nuclear reactor, its destruction was blamed on a CIS bombing. Tarkin was actually pulled from this campaign 2 years before it was finished, so 17 BBY, in order to protect Sentinel Base, the construction site of the Death Star. Ironically, this reaction to the first of the CIS holdouts would spread terror and destroy communities to an extent that just spawned the more diffused threat of hundreds of different rebel cells, a threat which Tarkin circularly reasoned could only be solved by the Death Star. Though countless CIS personnel would be lost during this time, some decided to just fade into obscurity like General Cleave. The Devanirian was forced to retreat during the Battle of Kalar, but while traveling, he saw the transmission of Palpatine becoming Emperor and declaring that the war was over. Instead of keeping the Separatist hope alive, he carved out a spice empire in the Outer Rim planet of Lon. But he did help a young Caleb Dune evade Imperial authorities. This would be his one final fight against the descendants of his Republic enemies, as he used his modified freighter to attack a Gazanti prisoner transport. From there we move on to Raxus, which was the capital of the Separatists, but the recapture of this world was actually mostly bloodless. Some holdouts were there of course, but only very small bands that knew that their action was essentially death by Empire, as they simply didn't want to accept defeat. But the vast majority of the population fled Raxus before Imperials arrived, while the ones that stayed went out of their way to present all of their weapons, blasters, and other war materiel to the invading forces. Many of their CIS capital ships, and those captured during the Western Pacification, were dismantled at the Bilbringi shipyards. By 15 BBY, the Separatist holdouts were officially all wiped out, but of course this was a bit of an exaggeration for propaganda. This is a galactic-scale conflict, so recovered Republic intelligence and Separatist logs could be used to try and find you some heavy firepower. Rex and Phoenix Squad were able to track down a Separatist supply ship that crash-landed on Agamar. Here they were able to salvage proton bombs, but not before taking on perhaps the most patriotic of CIS holdouts, General Kalani. After a fight dubbed the Final Battle of the Clone Wars, now in the year 2 BBY, Kalani understood that Palpatine was the Separatist's true enemy all along. He was able to survive an Imperial attack and escape via a sheathipede to regions unknown. Then, a full 50 years after the Battle of Geonosis and the opening of the Clone Wars, B1s and B2s were still fighting to preserve the CIS. This is the result of the CIS capturing clone trooper CT-6116 on Coruscant and using the cruiser or Brexta 3 to try and transport him to Sereno. The crew locked him into a cryo-cycle stasis pod, but in the escape they were heavily damaged by Republic forces and had to do an emergency jump to hyperspace. They popped out on the other side of the galaxy, crashing into the Ponema terminal in the Outer Rim. The organics were killed by the Republic's attacks, but a lone B1 took the lead and had the other droids powered down before draining themselves, so that they could silently be waiting for the revival by the CIS leadership. Over time, the ship gained some lore in pirate circles, as it was thought to be bringing a Jedi treasure from Coruscant to Sereno, and thus was dubbed the Lost Treasure of Count Dooku. People speculated where that ship jumped to all those years before, but it was Sidon Athano who managed to find it. The problem was that these droids had been reserving their power for just such an intruder, and both B1s and B2s opened fire on the pirate and his crew. This final group of accidental Separatist holdouts were all destroyed, however, when the Obrexta 3 exploded following Athano's escape. But that was not before they awakened the being in the stasis pod, an old Clone Wars vet who didn't go by his number, but instead said that his name was Kix. Using the ship logs that they also stole on their way out, they were able to raid other Separatist locations across the galaxy. It is unknown how many other members of the CIS Remnant still exist, or what Kalani's ultimate fate will be. So that's it for the Separatist holdouts in canon, but you definitely want to hear the cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. References for all this comes from the novels Tarkin, Catalyst, and the Rogue One novelization. Other stuff comes from the Kanan 4 comic, and in Vader 4 we actually see some battle droids being used by the final Geonosian Queen. I didn't count them as holdouts as they didn't have CIS alliances, just to the Queen, as they were half bug. And other commando droids used by Vader were also just working for him. But there is the case of Umbarans using CIS droid fighters against the Empire, but this was really a Night Swan campaign, not a Separatist one, though the Umbarans definitely get some credit for fighting long after the official end of the war. Whether you want to see that as them fighting for the CIS or just Umbara is up to you, but the story comes from the Thrawn novel. Sidon's story comes from the Crimson Corsair and the Lost Treasure of Count Dooku, with additional details coming from the Star Wars Galactic Atlas. Remember, this was all canon, but I do want to do a Legends version of this video too, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. But that's it for the Separatist holdouts in canon. If you want to connect with us, help support the channel, or get your own copies of the reference materials used to make this video, be sure to check out the links in the description. Special shout out to our supporters over on Patreon, but most important of all, remember, my sources confirmed Kalani kills Kylo and Rey in episode 9. And the Force will be with you, always.